start from the beginning, Chaver. Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishbi, Eliyahu hagiladi, Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishbi, Eliyahu hagiladi. Bim heiro yavah yeleinu, yavah yeleinu, im Mashiach ben David, im Mashiach ben David. Bim heiro yavah yeleinu, yavah yeleinu, im Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David. Chaver, I'm not sure if you noticed, and I forgot to mention earlier, but this evening, B'siyata D'Shmaya is being recorded. You can see these two little big mics on the sides of the stage. And it's taking all of you in because that's the only way I decided to make another album. To the Chaver with me, enough of my only my voice. So we need harmony, we need your clapping, we need your energy, we need everything. Please help us out. Hey, la, 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 la.
Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. Another beautiful melody from Rabbi Shlomo Katz. I had a pause. I love playing his songs here while the countdown clock is going at the beginning of our shows. But we are now in the 3 weeks. We had the fast of Tammuz a few days ago. So we count down that the 17th of Tammuz is when the walls of Jerusalem were breached, and then the Holy Temple was destroyed 3 weeks later on the 9th of Av. That's Tisha B'Av. And when we get to Tisha B'Av, that's going to be a full day of fasting, not just a daytime fast, but a full 25-hour fast like Yom Kippur. When Av begins, when we reach the Hebrew month of Av with Rosh Chodesh Av, the first day of Av, so I think that's a week from Wednesday, then we'll be in the 9 days. Now, according to some opinions, there's just no music listening during the whole 3 weeks. But there's some leniency in the first half of that, especially when we're using music like we do here to promote Torah learning. But once we get into those 9 days, from the first day of Av until Tisha B'Av, so then we can sing, but no instruments. And I'm not going to, make my singing be the singing that we listen to. So I'll have to think of something else to do for those 9 days. And then after Tisha B'Av, we'll get back to Rabbi Shlomo Katz's incredible music. We love it so much, and it's great to listen while the timer is counting down. How are you, my sisters and brothers? It is great to be with you. We have a fascinating daf. Today we're going to be talking about Shabbos and childbirth, Shabbos and some medical treatments when people are sick, and some really interesting principles that we can apply to our health at all times, but that we learned from the ancient practice, which was very common back then, no one does it anymore, of bloodletting, right? It used to be a medical practice that they would just let out some blood, and when they did that, then they would have to take extra care of themselves, and we're going to be learning about that. So, let us light up the darkness. Who's in the house with us today? Okay. Stephen Geger was first. He says shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Vaughn Billow is in from Fremont, Ohio. Kathy Roy from Oklahoma. Melissa Eitel-Jurin says good evening from Great Neck, New York. James is in the house from Indianapolis. Rochelle Rosen says it's a beautiful evening in Modesto. Catherine Ernst is in from Vineta, Oregon. Bill Eldridge says hello from Berkeley. Sharon Frant Brooks says greetings from Lebanon, New Jersey. Lucy Ram Johnson is with us from Minneapolis. Sharon Frant Brooks asks Bill, how is your grandmother doing? Thelma, right? Bill, how is Thelma doing? Please let us know. Pablo Lewin is in from Glendora, which is in LA in California. Gene Lockhart says, hello from Idaho, USA. Robin Stewart is in from Ohio. Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago. Claudia Steiner says, shalom from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Donna Smith is in from Bahama, North Carolina. It's so good to see you in the comments, Donna. It's just lovely to have you with us. We got a nice note from Bill, and we're glad to know that you're feeling better. Martin Lee is in from Duluth, Minnesota, and I actually sing in the bass section of the local symphony orchestra. Martin, we need you here during those 9 days when singing is permitted but not instruments. Lorraine Angela Hare says, good evening. Mary Sanders is with us from Branson, Missouri. Samuel Kofi Abraham says, shalom from Ghana. Wow, welcome, Samuel. And for him, it's this morning. Here it's the evening in LA. Olivia Harris Barkoff is with us from Chicago. Michael Rivers says howdy. Christy Galloway is with us from Louisiana. Neil is saying Erev Tov from Virginia. And Lynn wishes us shalom from North Texas. All right, let's get into it. We've got a lot to cover. Where are we? We are on page 129. That's Kuf Chaf Tes. I want to make a note about yesterday's page before I continue. There were two questions. One was about playing games. Can we play Monopoly on Shabbos? And, I had an instinct about it, and I was glad to read that is the opinion. We can play games. We have to be very careful that we're not writing. So like a borderline game is Scrabble. You absolutely can't keep score with a pen and pad. You can't write. You can't put pen or pencil to paper. You can arrange the tiles because there's no permanence to it when you're making words on a Scrabble board. But there's some fancy Scrabble boards where there's a slot for, like a sort of like a box with ridges separating every place on the board from each other. And that you can't do because it's then like the tiles land in a place that will be permanent with greater permanence than if they're just lying on a flat board. Monopoly technically would be permissible, but because it's a game about transacting business, the modern sages who've had a chance to consider the question say, just don't do it. It's completely not in keeping with the spirit and sanctity of Shabbos. I also missed something on yesterday. The title of yesterday's class was No Cruelty to Animals Ever, right? Certainly not on Shabbos and not any day. And I actually just missed the little teaching from yesterday's page that led to me giving it that title. So I just want to say it. If an animal slips into a ditch on Shabbos. So as we learned yesterday, an animal is muktzah. We can't pick up the animal. We can sort of lead it or prod it, push it along, encourage it to go back into its stall so that it'll be safe, not wandering around in a dangerous place. If it's in a ditch, we can't pick it up. So what we can do is put like cushions and blankets into the ditch, which perhaps will enable it to climb out. Like let's say it's kind of a muddy embankment and it can't get a grip, so it can't walk out. Maybe it's like a lamb or a calf or something like that. And it's not steady enough to get itself out of a muddy ditch. And if we put some blankets on the side of the pit, as it were, it might be able to get out. So we would do that. Then the question was asked, well, it might not get out and it might end up sitting or lying on that blanket. That would be problematic because the blanket was prepared for Shabbos. Now you've made it a base for something that's muktzah. The calf is muktzah, so we can't lift up the calf. As we saw yesterday, we could overturn a basket so that chicks can walk back up into a chicken coop. But while they're on top of the basket, we can't lift the basket because the animals are muktzah. And the basket, which is a vessel, which is prepared for use on Shabbos, when it becomes a base for something that is muktzah, something set aside from use, now it can't be moved either. And the problem with that is you would negate the preparedness of something which was prepared for Shabbos. That's actually considered a form of destruction or dismantling, something that was available to be used on Shabbos, and then it becomes a base for something muksa, and therefore it can't be used anymore, that's actually something we don't want to do. It's prohibited by rabbinic decree. So if we're now going to put this blanket on the side of the pit and it's going to end up underneath the calf or the lamb, haven't we negated its preparedness? And the answer is yes, we've negated its preparedness, and we do it anyway, because negating the preparedness of an object for Shabbos means we'd be violating a rabbinic decree in order to spare the animal from suffering. And sparing an animal from unnecessary suffering is a Torah law. It's a Torah law. And so we of course, we're going to violate a rabbinic decree in order to fulfill a biblical obligation. Okay, that was from yesterday. Today we're talking about Mishnah number 3 here on our page 129 in Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're going to complete our discussion of chapter 18. It was a short chapter. It just has 3 Mishnahs in it. And today we're talking about the third Mishnah. The third Mishnah teaches that one may not birth an animal on a festival and especially not on Shabbos, but one may assist. So this is kind of an interesting, what does it mean? You can't birth it, but you can assist. So when we're talking about birthing an animal, we're definitely, thinking about a farming and agricultural community, right? Or shepherds, where people have a lot of their value, a lot of their, what's the word I'm looking for? Their net worth, let's say, in livestock, right? So livestock is incredibly important to the people in an agricultural economy. So what does it mean that they're going to birth an animal? I mean, most animals are certainly capable of giving birth on their own. If there's a problem, right, then people get involved. And why are they getting involved? I mean, they care about the animals, but they're also preserving their property. So here we have, as we saw just now in the teaching I just shared a moment ago, will override a rabbinic decree in order to fulfill the Torah obligation of preventing unnecessary harm to animals, for sure. But we're going to be careful and not violate biblical obligations, not to desecrate the Sabbath, not to desecrate Shabbos, in order to preserve our property. So it's going to be limited what we're going to be able to do for an animal that's having trouble in childbirth. And what we're going to avoid is desecrating Shabbos, and we're going to avoid something that's too big of an exertion on our part. What we will do is make sure that when the young comes out, it doesn't fall. We'll lower it gently to the ground. We will breathe into its nostrils if it's having trouble breathing, and we'll bring the mother's breast of the animal to the mouth of the young. That's in terms of animals. Now let's talk about a woman in labor giving birth to a baby. Here, we throw out all the rules. I mean, that's going to be the basic principle. When it comes to a woman in labor, we are going to do anything that she asks of us. Not just anything necessary, anything that she asks of us, because not only is her physical, not only is the fact that her life may be in danger and the newborn's life may be in danger, but the fact that she, may be stressed out is something that we're actually going to violate Shabbos to help her with. And we're going to see how that works. Okay, let's get into it. We're going to do anything necessary for the mother and for the baby. We're even going to bring a midwife to her, even if it requires desecrating Shabbos to bring the midwife. In other words, even if the midwife has to desecrate Shabbos in order to get to the woman in labor, we do it. We don't even think twice about it. We just do it. And then also this Mishnah is going to mention, and we're going to learn more about it in later pages. Here we're just going to mention that for a baby that is born, I guess it would be on a Friday, and so its 8th day of life is going to be the following Shabbos. If that baby's a male baby, a Jewish male baby, if its 8th day is Shabbos, we circumcise on the 8th day, So a circumcision is a surgical procedure. There's several things about it, several requirements of a circumcision that would require violating Shabbos in order to do it. And we do it. We override, we desecrate Shabbos in order to do a circumcision in its time. If the circumcision was delayed because the baby had jaundice or something like that, and we had to wait some time, okay, so then we would wait for the first, opportune day, and we would not do it on Shabbos since we have a choice of what day it would happen. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so now we start to look at how far we will go in order to comfort a woman who's giving birth. So let's say that she would like oil. Why does she need oil? I mean, it's not really going to be a medical thing, but let's say that it soothes her to have her skin rubbed by her friend with some oil. Okay, so then we anoint her with oil. And if the oil is not on the premises and it needs to be brought from another place, so that would, and let's say there's no Eruv in that neighborhood, so bringing the oil from another location to comfort the woman in labor is going to require carrying in the public domain and carrying in from the public domain into the private domain, and we're going to do it. We're going to try to minimize the amount that we desecrate Shabbos. So, for example, if she only needs a little bit of oil, maybe her friend will actually carry it in the palm of her hand. Or it can be like in a little flask that her friend can attach to her hair as an adornment. And so carrying it in an atypical manner. As we've seen, when we have to carry something or we have to move something that we'd rather not move on Shabbos, we do it in an atypical manner to signal to ourselves and to God and to our neighbors that we know we're not supposed to do this. We're doing it, for some higher purpose, let's say some important reason, but we're not going to do it in the typical manner because we have respect for Shabbos. But if the only way to bring this oil that's going to be used to comfort the woman in labor is to carry it in the typical manner, then we carry it in the typical manner. And then to show you the extent of how far this permit goes. And my friends, we're on page 129 of Tractate Shabbos. If you've been with me along this journey, you know how strict the sages are about keeping us from violating Shabbos. So if you're joining us for the first time, don't get the idea that, if we can think of an important reason, we'll just violate Shabbos. No. We generally don't desecrate Shabbos for anything, but the woman in labor is just beyond important, right? Beyond important. We'll do anything she needs. So much so that if a woman asks that a light be kindled on Shabbos, right? That's a direct Torah violation. The Torah says we do not kindle a light on Shabbos. If she says, please kindle a light for me, I need more light, we kindle a light for her. And we do it even if she's blind, even if she cannot see the light. But she says to herself, I'm worried that the people who are helping me, they might not see something because it's so dark in here, and I want them to have as much light as they might need, even though they have enough light. But to settle her mind and her stress, we would even light a light for a blind woman who can't see it herself, but whose mind will be a little bit more at ease if we light the light that she requested. For how long does this permit to desecrate Shabbos exist, right? Is it just while she's literally in the pangs of labor? How long do we define the child, the birthing period to last? And so here, there's a little bit of back and forth among the sages. So I'll just go to the passage that is going to end up becoming the halakha. This is the law. The sages of Nehardea say, for a woman in childbirth, there are halachic distinctions between 7, and 30 days after she gives birth. The Gemara elaborates. And actually, this is when the period ends. When does the period begin? Let me just say that first. I thought it was open. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, with regard to a woman in childbirth, as long as the womb is open, whether she said, I need Shabbat desecrated, or she doesn't say, we desecrate Shabbos for her. So the period begins when the womb is understood to open, right? So it's like, I guess when she feels that she's entering labor, when those contractions start, that would be like that the womb is starting to open. So we're in the zone where we're going to do anything she needs from us. So for a woman in childbirth, there are halachic distinctions between 3, 7, and 30 days after she gives birth. The Gemara elaborates, during the first 3 days after birth, whether she said, I need Shabbos to be desecrated, or whether she did not say, I need Shabbos to be desecrated, one desecrates Shabbos for her, right? So if we think that there's something that she needs to help her along, even if she says, don't desecrate Shabbos for me, if there's any chance that it's going to help her, we do it. Between 3 and 7 days after birth, if she said, I need Shabbos to be desecrated, one desecrates Shabbos for her. But if she did not say, I need Shabbos to be desecrated, one does not desecrate Shabbos for her. So from 3 to 7 days, we understand that she's past that critical time. It's not really going to make that much of a difference. But if she asks for it, we'll do it. And then between 7 and 30 days after the birth, even if she said, I need Shabbos to be desecrated, one does not desecrate Shabbos for her. However, we perform all necessary prohibited labors by means of a non-Jew. So anything that she asks for, the understanding here is that she's past being in danger. If for some reason a doctor or any kind of authority said, no, she's actually in danger, then it's like we're in the initial crisis and we do anything that's necessary at all times. Anytime somebody's life may be in danger, we desecrate Shabbos. Here, the understanding is she's no longer in danger, and she wasn't in danger even after 3 days, but even after from the 3rd to the 7th day, even though she's not in danger, to comfort her, we'll desecrate Shabbos if she asks us to. But after 7 days, we won't. We'll attend to her needs, but we won't desecrate Shabbos during that period. Okay. Now that we're talking about the fact that the woman and her newborn are considered to be, in a critical period, is equivalent to a person who's very sick and their life is in danger, now we're also going to be talking about people who are sick. So for a woman in labor or one who is seriously sick and feels cold, we build a fire in any season, and we even break furniture in order to build that fire. So as medicine was understood, of course, 2,000 years ago, there were many things that they didn't know that we know now. But they had just a huge reservoir of experiential knowledge, right? Because there's always the folk wisdom that's passed down from generation to generation. But the advantage that the sages had over, let's say, other communities is they weren't just passing that knowledge down sort of midwife to midwife, local healer to local healer. But the sages themselves, because they were studying every aspect of human life, it's like there was an extra, container, an extra reservoir of wisdom being passed down from generation to generation. And that's why they're going to be very generous with sharing all these, bits of wisdom, of healing wisdom that they picked up in their studies of the human condition. So one thing that they were very conscious of is that when people are cold, okay, now remember, this is a society without antibiotics, without IV medicine, without hospitals, really. So they observed over time that a person who gets very cold, presumably somebody has a fever, they could easily enter a critical illness and be taken from this world because of it. So when somebody says they're cold, you take that very seriously. And we will desecrate Shabbos for a person who's sick. They're already sick, and now they're saying they're cold. We're going to make a fire for them. Some people ask, well, it makes sense in the winter, in the rainy season, but in the summer when it's really hot, do we really have to desecrate Shabbos and build a fire for them? And the answer is yes, we do. If they tell us, if they're sick and they tell us they're cold and they want it hotter even than it is now, we'll build a fire for them. And not only will we make a fire, if we have to destroy wooden furniture because there's no other wood around, we'll wreck the furniture and make the fire. And since we know, we've already established, we can desecrate Shabbos for the woman in labor, for her newborn, for a person who's very ill. Why does the Gemara feel the need to mention fire specifically? It should be already included in the principle, we desecrate Shabbos for people whose lives are in danger. Rav Steinsaltz suggests that this is also preventive care for the newborn. So even if mom is doing fine, right? Like we don't think that she has fever, we don't think that she's in danger, but she says, I think I would like it to be warmer. It's not like she's shivering, but she has an instinct that it should be warmer. We build a fire. We build a fire because maybe the baby needs it. And also, I suggest perhaps they feel the need to mention fire specifically because fire is mentioned in the Torah as something that we don't do on Shabbos. And not only that, but our sages, you remember not too long ago, we did a whole chapter on what happens when a fire breaks out on Shabbos, and there were very few things that could be saved from the fire. Food and clothing necessary for the Shabbat on which the house caught fire, and holy books, and little else could be saved from the fire. Now, the law changed, right? In medieval times, it became so dangerous as people lived, in more concentrated cities, and in Europe, where these cities where there was much more wood involved than the stone buildings that characterized living structures in the Holy Land, fire just became so much more dangerous. Plus, Jews were living amidst rabid Jew haters, and if a fire broke out in a Jewish home, it became an invitation, for looters and other attackers to come and pillage the Jewish community. And so, at that point, the authorities, the rabbis, the chief rabbis of that period ruled, no. Any fire that breaks out on Shabbos doesn't even have to be dangerous, doesn't have to be large. If there's any chance that fire could lead to destruction, lead to destroying a home, etc., we put it out. We desecrate Shabbos and we extinguish a fire as soon as it breaks out. So having spent all that time establishing, but back then, in Talmudic times, they wouldn't put out a fire even if it endangered a home. It was like, okay, if you were a pious person and your house caught fire on Shabbos and no lives were in danger and you got the food and, clothes that you needed just for that Shabbos, and then beyond that, you just watch your house burn down, right? That's the world that these guys lived in. The law changed later, but that's the world as it was in Talmudic times. So given that they lived in that world, it's really saying a lot that when somebody just wants to be comfortable because they're in childbirth, right? I mean, not just, but a woman in childbirth, she's given birth, right? She already gave birth, let's say 3 days ago, but now she'd like to be warm. Or a person is sick and they say, I feel a little cold. We start a fire for them. It just shows you how extensive that permit is. Now that we're talking about illness and how we treat illness and how we'll desecrate Shabbos if people are ill and they need warmth, now we start to talk about bloodletting. So bloodletting, it's not like I know so much about it, but some of my favorite books in the world are called the Aubrey Michurin novels. It's 20 novels detailing the adventures of a British naval captain in the Napoleonic Wars, early 1800s, and his dear friend, the ship's doctor, Stephen Michurin. They made a movie called Master and Commander based on those books. And even 200 years ago, medicine was so primitive compared to today. They just had very few things they could do for a person who was really suffering. They just didn't have that many treatments. They had various herbs. They had, they had opium that they could give people to soothe the pain. Obviously, in a battle, if there were wounds, they could amputate a limb, things like that. But for most illnesses, there was very little they could do. They didn't even have penicillin. They didn't have aspirin. So there was just very little that they could do. One of the standard treatments was letting blood, right? They would actually just lance a vein and just drain you of some amount of blood. And they understood that this would kind of relax you. I guess maybe that's what it was. It would make you tired and weary, and perhaps it would settle the mind a little bit. But it was just a very common practice, and so it was in 1800, and so it was 2,000 years ago in Talmudic times. So bloodletting was a common procedure. What our sages come to tell us is after one has had his blood let, he's vulnerable, right? Somebody who's had the bloodletting procedure is like one who is vulnerable. And now we can definitely start to make some analogies to things that we know in modern times. We know a lot about medicine, but we can't cure everything. And we know that when somebody is immunocompromised, okay, so they're in danger, right? That is a time of danger. And so there are certain things that they did for people back then and certain principles related to it that is definitely worth keeping in mind today. So Shmuel, when he underwent a, when Shmuel underwent a bloodletting and they broke, so we know that if somebody is sick and they need to be kept warm, we'll break up furniture and start a fire for him even on Shabbos. So Shmuel had that need. He was cold after a bloodletting, right? So he wasn't sick. It's not like he was suffering from a disease. Sometimes they just did this on a somewhat regular basis, which it was thought to be a preventative treatment. But having had the treatment, now you're vulnerable and you would get cold. And so they broke a beautiful teak armchair to make a fire for him because that's the only wood that was available. And now we're not necessarily talking about treatments that we'll do on Shabbos and desecrate Shabbos for. Now we're just going to be talking about bloodletting generally. So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav that one should sell the beams of his house if he needs to in order to buy shoes, right? So in other words, like a person who doesn't have shoes is so vulnerable that if he lacks shoes but has some kind of a house, he should sell the beams of his house in order to get shoes on his feet. That's how important shoes are. However, if he's just recently had a bloodletting and he can't afford to have a good meal after the bloodletting, he should even sell his shoes, right? That's how important shoes are, and that's how important it is to have a good, healthy meal after being drained of some blood. And what kind of a meal should he have? So Rav says meat, right? What kind of a meal should he have? Rav says meat, and Shmuel says wine. That when some blood is taken away from you, what does your body need? Rav says meat, Shmuel says wine. Most of them will agree that you need a meal that includes meat and wine. Okay, so you need to replenish yourself. Now, we could argue about, red meat and whether alcohol, but the idea that somebody who has gone through some health stuff, somebody that's undergoing treatment for something, somebody that's immunocompromised, somebody whose health is compromised in some way, they need to take extra good care of themselves and make sure that they get the nutrition that their body is calling for. That's the principle that matters here. Now, with respect to getting wine after a bloodletting, let's assume for a moment that somebody who's had a bloodletting must get wine. And let's assume that that person is so poor that he can't buy wine for himself. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says that all artifice is prohibited. You can't mislead someone else into helping you in some way. Artifice is prohibited in all cases between one person and another person, except in the case of one who has had a bloodletting, he needs wine, he can't afford to buy wine. That person, just to preserve himself from dying, from potentially dying because he's so vulnerable right now, that person can go to a wine shop and just taste. Said, I'd like to taste some wine. And then after he's tasted some wine, he can offer to pay for the taste that he had. But let's say he's only got a worn out coin. So in the ancient times, coins were manufactured of softer metal. They didn't have the alloys that we have now. They didn't have the production machinery that we have now. They just kind of pressed these coins. And these coins, when they were in general circulation for a while, they would wear down. And it was understood that even though it's the same metal, once it's worn down, there's a little less of that metal. And the way you measure that is like, can you see the head of the ruler of the land who's imprinted onto that coin? Once the head of that person has worn down, most merchants won't accept it. So this person who takes a taste of the wine and then offers to pay for it with a worn down coin, the merchant will say, keep your coin. And then he can go to another store and have another taste of wine and offer to pay for it with that worn out coin. And he can do that as much as 7 times. It's an artifice. And our sages are definitely telling us that you should never do that. That is wrong. You don't do that. But here it's understood that he could do it because he's saving his own life by doing it. I'll just mention in passing, we won't come to this in our Talmud journey for a couple of years, but when we get into the middle tractates, which are about commercial situations and transactions, we'll learn that the sages prohibit going into a store and pretending that you're interested in the merchandise if you have no intent to buy, right? Because that can diminish the value of that merchandise in the eyes of somebody else who is watching this. Like you looked at it, considered, thought about buying it, and then put it down and walked away as if there's something wrong with it, so that you could hurt the person's business. Moreover, you're wasting the salesman's time if you never had an intent to buy. This is especially true today when people often go to the store thinking, I want to see the item in my hand, but I'm going to order it on Amazon where I can get it cheaper. And if we're going to be righteous people and mensches, we should be aware that there's a person there who's going to maybe help you and talk to you about that item. And it is worth paying a little bit extra to get the benefit of that expertise and to help that salesman or saleswoman make a living. Okay. That's the bloodletting. Okay, we also have a little principle here, really worth remembering, about being indifferent. Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel were sages in Bavel, in Babylonia. They were heads of the community, but sort of the chief rabbi of different regions of Babylonia. And they lived in the same generation and argued about many things. But here's something that Rav and Shmuel agree on. Rav and Shmuel both said, anyone who is indifferent and not vigilant with regard to the meal eaten after bloodletting, they are indifferent with regard to providing his food from the heavens. And they say in the name of heaven, he took no pity on his own life. Why will we take pity on him? Right? So, if you think about it, how often have we been negligent to the point of being reckless with our own health? Right? When we know we should do different things, when we know that there are things we shouldn't do because it endangers our health. But hey, in the moment, it's just fun and whatever. I'll start my new health regimen tomorrow. Our sages are telling us if we're going to be that careless about our health, right, then later, when our health really becomes endangered because we didn't take care of ourselves, up in heaven, the community up there will look down and say, oh, now you come to us desperate. Why didn't you take care of yourself when the situation wasn't desperate? Worth remembering. Okay. And Rav and Shmuel also both said, and this is great, there are certain things, certain activities that when we do them, we should sit for a little while after we do them and not just pop up and get on with our day. And if we do just pop up and get on with our day after doing these activities, so we're endangering ourselves, right? When they talked about just now that somebody who is indifferent with respect to their own health after a bloodletting, they're not going to have so much pity on him up in heaven. So same thing. If we're not careful enough to just, sit for a little while after these activities before we pop up and get on with it, then they're not going to have so much pity on us in heaven, right? So these are activities that you got to rest a bit before you get back to your day, lest you endanger your health. And what are these 5 activities? So one is bloodletting. Rav and Shmuel both said, with regard to one who performs the practice of bloodletting, let him wait a bit, and then let him rise. As the master said, there are 5 matters that render one closer to death than life, and they are these. If one ate and immediately arose, right? We don't do that. If you eat a meal, you need to sit there a little while, let it settle, and then, say a blessing after you ate. It's a good way to let it sit a little bit. Say your blessing afterward. And then slowly rise and get on with your day. Number 2, one ate and immediately arose. If one drank and rose, it doesn't say alcohol. It just says if one drank. But I would think all the more if one had wine or beer or stronger liquor. Don't just drink and run. Right? Have your drink, let it settle, make your blessing afterward, and then go. If one slept and immediately arose, not good to, you wake up in the morning and run. That takes planning, right? You got to have a little bit of planning so that when you wake up in the morning, you can lie there a little bit and sort of let the day come on you. Another way to, have that appropriate time of settling after you wake up and before you get up is you can say Modeh Ani, giving thanks to God for restoring your soul to you because God has faith in you. That's something you can say while you're preparing to get up after waking up. If one let blood and rose, right? So after a bloodletting, you don't just jump up and go. And we might think that applies to all medical procedures. And if one engaged in marital relations, you don't just, do your thing, you and your spouse, and then jump up and run, right? Sit there a little bit, whisper a few sweet things, let the day come back upon you, and then get up and go. Okay. And that brings us to the end of this chapter, chapter 18. Now I'm going to take comments and questions, but I would say that our takeaway from chapter 18 is we already knew that we would desecrate Shabbos if somebody's life was physically in danger. Now we learned that a woman giving birth, even though it can be a perfectly healthy, perfectly normal birth, still for that whole time around her labor, she's considered to be someone who's in critical condition, and we do absolutely anything that she needs or requests. And that's a real takeaway, that somebody who's in a critical time, it's not just what are their physical needs, what are their emotional and mental needs, right? That's part of healing. Part of healing is that people feel comforted, that they feel comfortable. And I think anyone, who's a nurturer, anyone who's a nurse, anyone who's a doctor, I think knows that. I mean, I think we know that, but it's certainly something worth remembering. And it just made me think, right, chicken soup, right? Why is mom's chicken soup considered medicine, right? Everyone talks about chicken soup as medicine. And I would say because especially if somebody is ill and they know that the chicken soup wasn't just like it was the chicken soup they made last week and now they're bringing me some, but rather the chicken soup was made for me because I'm sick, well, you're going to feel the love, right? And, people who have the blessing that when they're ill, they have people around them who take care of them. That's going to help so much. It helps so much. And that's why it is such a big mitzvah to visit the sick, right? When we visit people who are sick and bring our love, our care, our concern from them, it really, and the Talmud teaches elsewhere, every time we visit a sick person, we remove 1/60th of their illness. And it's true, and maybe it's even more than 1/60th. It really, really matters in treatment that people feel loved and cared for. Okay, let's see if we have comments and questions. Elaine Courtney says, what about sorting? I think you're talking about games. And so with regard to games, it's interesting, like you could play Scrabble if you didn't keep score. writing down the score on paper, and you could put the tiles down on the words, but when you're done, you can't, or like you can play a card game on Shabbos, but when you're done, you can't undo the game and put all the pieces back in their places, because that's considered sorting, which is a biblically prohibited labor on Shabbos. So that's why generally better not to get involved in games at all, because there are some nuances where we could come to violate Shabbos accidentally. So generally not so good to play board games. Better to play word games in your head if you must, but ideally talk about higher things. Sharon Frant Brooks says, dog walking. Well, you can't carry the dog for sure. I don't know what the status of the leash is. But I've seen, certainly there's an Eruv in the neighborhood. I think it's going to be fine. And I think we saw that you can lead the animal back home as long as you're not carrying it. But I'm a little uncertain about the leash. I'd have to look up if there's something about the leash I'm not thinking of. On the other hand, you want to prevent the dog from suffering, right? So if it has to go outside to go to the bathroom, then I'm sure we're going to have a greater permit to do that so that the dog doesn't suffer. Okay, Lynn says, big day today. Logistics makes immersing my utensils impossible. I found a non-Jew to receive a gift of everything with a permanent loan back to me for use forever. So she's talking about that under certain circumstances, we need to immerse, like new vessels, when we get silverware or plates. We need to immerse them in a Kaylee mikvah, right? They actually get immersed in water in not a place where humans immerse themselves, but just a smaller type of mikvah for vessels and utensils. But these days with COVID, a lot of those places are closed, and it becomes a problem if we want to get new vessels and utensils. And Lynn found a way around that, a legal structure for not needing that mikvah, and that's great. Beaufort Clifton Addison III says it applies to matchmaking too. I'm not sure what we're talking about, but with regard to matchmaking, it's a classic teaching from the Talmud that introducing soulmates to each other is more difficult than parting the Sea of Reeds. When the children of Israel left Egypt and the sea was parted for them, that was an easier miracle for God to handle than bringing soulmates together. And so anyone who's actually able to, introduce people to each other who end up getting married, it's a huge, 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 huge blessing. It's so difficult to achieve. Olivia Harris Barkov says, what's amazing is how these values are in us without realizing they were written down by our rabbis and teachers so many centuries ago. Quite so, just so. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Tomorrow, with God's help, we're going to open chapter 19. And so we've introduced the discussion of the bris, of the circumcision, and how it intersects with Shabbos. And we're going to go into greater detail about welcoming the Jewish baby into the physical covenant, right? And this was the first commandment, actual active commandment that was given to Abraham as a Jew. And we look forward to starting that tomorrow, sending you